Hey everybody, welcome to Drive Thru Review 741. Today we're going to take a look at Now or Never. This is coming out from Red Raven Games. It's designed and illustrated by Ryan Laukat, who I think he designs and illustrates all of Red Raven's games. And this is kind of, I think, the last in the trilogy of Above and Below, Near and Far, and then Now or Never, of these kind of sort of like a mashup between a Euro economic, mechanically driven kind of game with a lot of story elements. There's a storybook where you can read different passages in the vein of like Tales of the Arabian Nights and stuff like that. And so this is the latest kind of iteration in that style of design. It's a competitive game. It plays 1 to 4 players. The theme of the game is interesting. Basically, some meteorites and stuff have basically attacked the region that you all live in, and that happened in the past. And there's been a bunch of monsters that have come and basically pushed everybody out. They've scattered. And now those monsters are kind of starting to die off a little bit, and then you're bringing people back into and sort of recruiting them and getting different specialists and villagers and building up kind of your own little city and that kind of thing. Sort of rebuilding your civilization from the ashes, if you will. And there's like a little sort of 6-part story that you can play through that has some narrative elements to it that will also change up some of the game mechanics and stuff like that. But you don't have to play it that way if you don't want. You can just kind of play the straightforward kind of game with some other different variants and stuff like that mixed in. So let's jump down to the table and I'll show you how it works, and then I'll come back and tell you what I think. Okay, so I've got a lot of stuff set up here, and this game does take up a fair amount of table space. Now you can see this really long board here in the middle. Well, this is where your character, and your character has this little standee, which you can see here. They're going to be moving around here, interacting with different little villages and townships and fighting monsters, going on quests, all kinds of different stuff. So you're going to be moving them around the board there. Also, each player is going to have a little player board like this, and you can see this kind of matches my character here, Namal. Now, these are asymmetric characters here, and so you can see we have Zeke here, we have Halia, and then we also have Marklin there. And they have, each of them has a little special ability. They have various amounts of hit points and mana that they'll have access to. So you can see Namal here, I think she has got more hit points than anybody. She's got 15, but she only starts with 2 available mana in her mana pool. And then she's got a list of abilities, which there's a little bit of glare on. Over on the left, those are kind of like offensive fighting abilities. And then she also has here some, not necessarily always defensive abilities, but the blue ones are typically defensive or something that you might use, during your turn other than fighting. And then a little stack of more offensive abilities that you can place out here and upgrade in these slots over on these 2 sides there. So that's all asymmetrical. Now each player is also going to be dealt out a couple of these starting specialists here to start the game. Everybody's going to have 2 of those. And so that's the other part of the game. One part of the game is you're going to be moving around, kind of doing adventures and stuff, possibly reading out of some of these chapter books. Here's chapter 1. Now you don't have to play with these books. You can play kind of the non-story mode thing, but we'll get to that in a minute. So you're going to be moving around doing that stuff. The other part of the game is activating these specialists. So when you activate a specialist on your board, you're going to pay this cost at the top, $4 or $5. And you activate it. In this case, this lady here will help us build a building, and you'll flip her over. She'll flip back up at the start of the next round. But you can also activate specialists that are on somebody else's board. So if this specialist was on somebody else's board, I'd still have to pay the $5, and I could activate it and do whatever I need to do out of it. That player, though, would take the smaller amount out of the bank as kind of like a tax. So I pay 5 into the bank, they would take 3 out of the bank, and then of course this would flip over. Now they may not be very happy about that, but that's part of the game. And they'll also get kind of a compensation for that. Now the other thing that you can do with specialists, of course, is recruit new ones. So off to the side here, you've got more specialists here. There would always be 4 available. And let's say I wanted to recruit her here. So this lady here, her ability is she'll give you 2 experience points, and then she'll give you a tool, which is a resource you can use. Now to recruit here, you pay double the big amount, so I need to pay 8. So I will take her, recruit her, and when you recruit a specialist, you get to immediately activate him as you recruit them, and then you'll take him, do the activation, and then flip him over, and then that will be your turn. And so the game basically consists of those 2 things. You either do a specialist action, which is either use one on your board, somebody else's boards, or recruit one and then put it on your board. So you can either do a specialist action, that's any of those 3 things, Or you can do a hero action, which is moving your figure on the board and then interacting with different stuff on the board there. Now before we get to the adventure board, let's go back down to our player boards. So as I showed you, you can do buildings. You can build buildings with some of the specialists. Now everybody has this identical board here, and this is where you're going to be placing your little building tiles, which you can see off to the side there. So there's a couple of rules to keep in mind here. Let's take a look at our little display of buildings over here. So everybody has the exact same set of buildings here in their player color. You can kind of see them on the back there. And you're going to randomly shuffle these up and distribute them in a 4x5 grid. But again, all the buildings are the exact same. So the first time that you build a building, you have access to anything on the outer edge. So if I wanted to build this one here, I could choose to build that if I wanted. You can see the cost here would be 4 coins, and I could build and put that over on my board. Now, after I've built my first building, that basically locks all of the ones on the outside. I no longer have access to those. Now for the rest of the game, I have access to only buildings adjacent to an empty spot. So now I have access to these 3 buildings here. And then let's say I built this one here. Now I have access to these 4 buildings here, or these 5 buildings, excuse me, this one, this one, this one, this one, this one, because they're all adjacent to these empty spots there. So when you start the game, you kind of want to look at your buildings, look at how much they cost, because at the beginning of the game, you're not going to have, too much money. And then kind of figure out a little pathway through the buildings and figure out kind of what your strategy is for getting those built. When you build a building, so let's say we build this one, we'll go back over here. The first time you build a building has to go on this bottom row. Let's zoom in just a little bit because the lines are a little faint, but they're not bad in person. So you can see these lines here like this. So you have to build one on the bottom row to start. And you can see when you build one on this bottom row, you'll get this shell resource here. So I'll build that right there, and then bam. Now, after I've started building, from now on for the rest of the game, I can only build orthogonally adjacent to this building. So I can build here, here, or here. It can start to move up. And just for note here, you have these resources which are a little too big, but it's not too bad for these spots. And you're going to track these resources here. So once I built that, you can see I'm going to generate a shell there. And you keep track of these. If you get up and go up to 9 and go to 10, you just put one of the big coins underneath it and then track it. And then I'll just know that you have 10 plus whatever you're at there. So you're going to build these buildings out here. Now the reason you're building these buildings is to get these villagers into your building. So for each building in this row, you can put a villager. We'll grab one of these over here and I'll show how you get these in a minute, and put that there. So for each building, I can have 1 villager here. So in the production phase, the reason you're doing this, and this is how you get all your points at the end of the game, your buildings are all going to generate this resource. So this is going to generate more shells for you. And then each villager is going to generate a different resource here. And these are demons in a bottle. So you can see there are 4 different types, if we zoom in here, of villager types. And they basically just correspond to the different resources. So once I get 4 buildings in here, then I can have up to 4 of these villagers in this space. And these are all the different types. Of course, the illustration of their character is going to vary, but the main important gameplay part is these little icons there. Now there are some buildings, like this one here, that give you access to basically housing more than 1 villager, because each building by itself houses 1 villager. Any buildings like with this symbol here can house an extra villager. So if I had these 2 built like this, I could have 1, 2, 3 extras because of that. So right now, technically, I can't have all of these villagers in here. Now, if you collect a villager, which I'll show you how you do that in a minute, and you don't have a spot to put them, you just put them off the side of the board. And then any time on your turn or somebody else's turn, if you want, you can just kind of plop them into a spot where they can be. Now, once you put them on the board, you can't move them. They're locked in. There is another building that breaks that rule, but for the most part, you can't move these things once you lock them in. Now, some of these other spots here, you can see these actually cost a little extra. So if I were to build this one here for some reason, it would cost me the 5 plus the 2. If I build a building there, it'll give me an extra book resource, which is this little symbol here, right there. So if I had this little book resource there, that will go up. And importantly, if we zoom in here, let me just mess with my camera a minute. If I have all 4 buildings in this row here, I'll get 6 points at the end of the game. If I have all 4 buildings in this row, 7, and then 8. And also important here with the villagers, if I have 1 of each type of villager in this row, 5, 5, 5, 6, and 7. So you want to have kind of a variety of types in the various different rows if you can, to give you these endgame scoring bonuses. So that's kind of the gist of all kind of the economic sort of city building types of activities that are going to go on your board. And again, the main point of this, before we jump to the adventure part, is to have all of these buildings and villagers and whatnot generate and produce all of these different types of resources at the end of each round, and finally at the end of the game. Now, what's actually going to happen before the last sort of production phase at the end of round 6, because this is a 6-round game, you're going to reduce all of these to 0, whether you spent them or not. And there's no reason not to spend them ever. You're going to reduce all those to 0. You're going to discard any coins that you might have in front of you. And then you're going to look at all of the stuff that you've built. You'll have built way more than this, and generate all of that, and then generate all the money out of that. And that's going to be the big thrust of your points. So there's not really any sort of traditional kind of resource conversion in this. So let's take a look at that over on this market board and how that kind of works. So if we look at this market board, there's a couple of things here. Here's the round tracker here. You can see you play 6 rounds. You've got a reputation track here. You do this when you're playing story mode. The other side of this board does not have this reputation track. This is where you pick up your villagers from, and here you've got some other special abilities like I showed you, but instead of just being individualized for your character, those cost experience, and these cost money, and you can upgrade your offensive and defensive capabilities here. But importantly here, if we take a look at this market right here, you can see any time on your turn, or even another player's turn, you can trade in these resources for varying amounts of money. And this is how you get your money. You always do a production phase at the end of the round, and then in the next round you're going to have, hopefully, a lot of resources that you can then convert to money, to build buildings, to do other things with. So if you see here, if I were to trade in 2 bottled demons and 2 crystals, I get 14 bucks. If I did 1 of each, I get 12. This configuration of these 3 different ones is 9, and so on. And then if you only trade in like 1 of them, you get 1 per shell, 2 for these other ones. And this is kind of like the rarity of villagers and stuff that will actually produce those. There's more shell producing villagers than crystals and so on. So at the end of the game, when you generate all of that stuff in the production phase, you're going to just trade all those in right away for money, and each dollar or coin is worth 1 point. So you're going to take those points plus any points here from all these bonuses for the buildings and villagers. Some of these buildings will give you extra bonus points and so on. There'll be some other things that score you points. But that's kind of the gist of that game. So let's jump up now to the adventure mode. So like I said, in lieu of doing a specialist action, you can take a heroic action. And that's simply moving your character to somewhere on the board. And it has to be somewhere different than where they are. You can't move and then move back and do the same spot. You've got to go somewhere and interact with that location. Now to do that, you can see here everybody has 3 different heroic actions, and these are also asymmetrical. And there's other abilities and things that will maybe give you extra ones. But to do one of those actions, you'll take this little token here and move it. And so what that means is you can move 2 spaces. You can also move extra spaces for spending life points to move extra spaces. And there'll be other things that increase the speed and so on. But typically you have 3 heroic actions you get per turn, so you want to use them wisely. So I can move 2 spaces, this one, and 3, and then 4, and so on. And when you move, you got to move orthogonally. There's no diagonal movement. So I can go 1, 2, or something like this, or 1, 2, like that. And then you will end up on a space, and then you'll interact with that space. Now it's worth knowing, if you move through, let's zoom in just a little bit here, a space with this little icon there, into a mountain space, you're going to lose 1 hit point. If you move into or through a monster space and you do not fight that monster, you also will lose 1 hit point. Now there's some other things you can get that kind of ignore that, but that's just generally what you need to keep in mind as you move around the board. And there's a few different things you can do with a spot. So let's say you were somewhere else and you moved back to the monument here. You could then take the start player marker, gain 4 health, and gain a coin. If you moved to a space with a monster, you could fight that monster. I'll talk about that in a minute. If you moved to one of these special buildings, for example, you can interact with that spot. And these are kind of randomly shuffled and put in various spots of the board. So here you could spend a life point, a book, and then you can get one of those villagers. So that's a way that you can get a villager. If you move to a spot here with one of these tokens, this is a search action. And this is where the story mode comes in. Now, if you don't play with the story mode, you can just do this very simple action when you want to do a search. everybody starts with a 4-sided die. So to do a search, you basically roll this die. So I got a 1. Whoop, there it is. I got a 1 in this case. So I'm going to lose that many hit points. So in this case, I would lose 1 hit point. You could lose up to 4. You're going to take this. Oops. And then you're going to get the reward on the back of it. In this case, I would get $5. And then you're going to take and put this on your player board, and this is going to generate 1 money for you every round. Now, some of these, like this one here, for example, will reward you a villager and tell you to discard this. So you get a villager, which is really good, but you don't get that extra dollar income every round. Now, if you are playing with the story mode, instead of just rolling a die and then seeing what kind of fancy rewards you get, you're going to look at the letter, in this case D, of the spot where that search token is. And based on which chapter you might be playing through, the game is meant to be played, if you want to, in sort of a campaign. So you've got chapter 1 through 6. So you're going to take your character. So we've got here Namal. We're going into space D, for example, and we're going to look her story up here. You can see there's stories here for the heading based on different characters. So I think Namal is back here. So you're going to look at number D here. And then if you're playing with other players, will read you this, and then they won't necessarily read you the reward. I mean, the rules are kind of loosey-goosey on that. You could have them read you the reward or whatever. That's probably more fun if you don't. If you're playing solo, then you can try not to read the reward. But what it's always going to say is it'll say you can do A or B, and you have a choice. And A is like skill 6, and B is skill 8, and that's all you know. So what you do is you roll this die, and you contribute that much to the skill. So I rolled 2, so let's say I was doing a skill 6. So I'm 2, so I'm 2 points all the way there, and I have to spend hit points. So I'd have to spend 4 more hit points to succeed at that. And if I succeed at that, there'll be some reward for me. And you can always, if you want, kind of go above and beyond. You can do 2 points beyond the target skill, and that'll give you kind of like a bonus and that kind of thing. And typically, you'll get a reputation bonus here, and you can see you get different amounts of points as you move up. The player with the most reputation will get 3 points, and there's some other implications for some of the campaign stuff like that as well. So that's the search part, and that's the only real difference between kind of the basic sort of straight up board game mode and kind of the story mode. Now the other thing you can do is there's a lot of different things you can do. The only thing I'm going to go over now is the monster fighting, because that's very important. You'll do that a lot. I'll talk about monster fighting and then the quests, and then I'm going to be here forever if I talk about everything. So let's say we go here and fight this monster. Now these are seeded into the board, and you can see this is kind of like the level 1 style monster. And it goes all the way up to level 9. There'll be a various different amount based on various numbers of players. And you can see this one here has 7 hit points. It will do 2 damage back to you, and the reward will be another villager and an experience. So here we have a little card on the back of this player aid card here, so we can track its hit points. So it's got 7 hit points there. We'll zoom out a little bit there. And then what you're going to do is you're always going to roll a die. So we'll see, okay, we got a 3 in this case. So we're going to look at our player board, and we can see, oh, we're going to do 3 damage to it. But if we'd have upgraded that, then we would have done 4 damage, or we would have had this one here, 5 damage, plus we can spend one of our mana tokens here to do an extra 3 damage. And so you've got to get to a certain amount of damage, and once you kill it, then you'll get this reward. But the thing you have to remember is it's always going to damage you back, even on the turn that you kill it. And if for some reason, like, you both sort of collectively defeat each other at the same time, the monster is going to win, and you're not going to collect anything, and you're going to be at 0 hit points. Anytime you're at 0 hit points, you cannot move around or do any kind of heroic action. You have to find a way to heal up. Now there are specialists like this one here. This action basically means just heal up to full health. So if you activated this, you could do that. Now the other thing is all the specialists here have a rest action. And you can only do this with specialists that are on your board, but you can just flip them over and take the rest action. This will heal for 2 or gain a coin. So if you get kind of stuck, you don't ever want to have to do this. Honestly, you should never do it in a game if you can help it. But then this is a way to kind of get you out of jail free, and then so you can start moving around and stuff like that. But that's pretty simple what it is. You just roll this, and then you do whatever action matches the slot. If you have any kind of defense, you might have some defense on some of the blue technologies and stuff on your character that will block some of the hits coming in, and then you're going to get different rewards. This guy, like we see here, gives us experience. So if we see here, this is one of the ways that we can get our own personal sort of asymmetric special abilities on the board. Is like, this costs 1 experience to put this on there. And the other thing experience is used for is refreshing these villagers. So new ones of these are not going to automatically come out as people start to collect them. Only once the last one is removed, then we're going to refresh with full 6. But if you're really looking for a specific one, because remember, you want a variety, you can always spend 2 experience to fill up any of the empty spaces there. And you can kind of do it as you collect them, where you're like, okay, maybe I killed a monster, a high level monster, I can collect 3 villagers. I'm like, okay, well, I'll collect this one because I know I need that. I don't need these 2. So now I can spend my 2 experience and then draw 4 and then keep going. So you can kind of do that kind of mid-collect, and that's okay to do that. So that's pretty much everything in the game. I want to talk about the quest cards up here. You'll start with some of these in your hand. So these are kind of the basic ones. You start with 4 of these, or excuse me, I think 6 of these, yep. And then 1 of these special ones, each of these special ones here, like so. So these 4 kind of like just sort of basic type ones. You have artifacts, and then kind of end game scoring ones basically. And from these that you're going to have in your hand, these 8, you're going to discard down to 4. And then anytime you visit a location, so this Ublo Tower, which we'll find on the map here, right there. So anytime you visit that, you can play 1 quest card matching that location. And it's pretty easy to find out where it is. You kind of just look at the art, you're like, oh, this is in the cave area, and this is in the desert area, or whatever. Sometimes there'll be a cost, so here you have to spend a book. And then it might give you a special ability that you persist through the rest of the game. You're going to score points. At the end of the game, you'll tuck these cards underneath the board so you can see the abilities and the points. Some of them will be worth like a lot of points here. Like this one's worth 6. And then for the rest of the game, you can spend a mana to turn any face down specialist face up. Could come in handy. This one here, you have to spend 2 books and have at least 4 villagers that produce shells. And then you can play this. And this is just like a larger point bonus one. So there's a bunch of these. And basically, anytime you move on the board and you end up in a location, you can play 1 of the cards. And if you have multiples for that location, you can't do them all at the same time. You can only do 1. So these are another way to score points and give yourself special abilities. But that is pretty much the game. Okay, so that is now or never. Let's jump into my pillars of review. First, let's talk about player count. I played this 1 player and 3 player. I haven't played a 2 or 4 player yet. I will say that single player I'm not a huge fan of, although I still have like an inkling to play it again single player. Mostly because I kind of like how the story stuff works, and I just kind of want to see how it goes and all the things that it changes up. We'll talk more about that in a minute. But I definitely prefer this with more players. I think at 2 player, I haven't played it, but I'd be more than happy to play it with 2 or 3 or 4, because the level of interaction there is pretty neat. Because you are sort of, possibly using other specialists, and they get that sort of tax compensation type of thing, but there's some interaction there. And there are some really kind of interesting choices there, because some of the specialists will be like, build a building, other one will be like build a building and then heal, or build a building and get experience. And so those kind of things where you might need that 1 extra experience, you might need that extra little tool that it generates or something, that kind of stuff sort of comes into play. And so that's an interesting piece of interaction. And then there's an interesting interaction on the venture board too when you're moving around, because there's only a limited amount of monsters to fight, and that's the primary way that you generate the villagers to come into your village and help you in the production. So there's a little bit of a race around to get that, and if you don't sort of keep up your technology, the arms race type of thing, the harder monsters you certainly won't be able to deal with at the end of the game, especially if you don't have any defense or some really big, powerful weapons that will do a lot of damage because they scale up and all that. So there's some good interaction sort of chasing down and racing down on the board, and also a little bit of that interaction with some of the specialist stuff. So I think the game really needs that interaction, which is totally missing from the single player game. Now, in terms of the play time, this game can actually go quite long. Now, there is a variant that's been put out, which I've actually tried. There's a short length and a medium length. And so I guess what's in the rulebook printed that comes with the box would be considered the long game or something. But the rules, in fairness, the rules do kind of say, like, expect kind of a big sort of epic experience here, especially when you add in the chapter books and the stories. Now, on the box it says 45 minutes per player. I think you could get to that point, but especially as players are learning the game. We had a 3-player game. Now, I had played it a couple times, and the other 2 were new, and it took us 4 hours to play it. And that's after rules, after everything else. It was 4 hours of solid play. Now, I will say, none of us thought actually that it didn't feel like 4 hours. At the end, I was kind of like, man, I feel like it went on a little too long. And then I was like, whoa, it was 4 hours? I said, it didn't feel like it went on that long, you know? So we had a good time with it. And I never really felt any downtime or anything, because as the other players were taking their turns, there's a lot going on. Like, the game is not like, I wouldn't call it like a complex game, like a Vita Lacerda game or something like that. But there's enough kind of going on. It's like, okay, well, I got my buildings here. You know, how should I kind of do that? Okay, if I get to this monster, I'm gonna need some experience. You know, there's all these kind of things going on. Oh, I got these quest cards in my hand. Okay, how does that work into my little strategy? So there's enough kind of going on as other players are doing their thing, that by the time it gets to my turn, I'm like, okay, the board changed a little bit. Not too much. So I might have to adjust a little bit. But it all kind of flowed, even though it took 4 hours. Now, I will say, for me personally, my plays of the game have picked up and increased, because you start to, you know, you get the hang of the game, and you kind of figure out the cadence between activating specialists, building buildings, those kind of things, getting new technologies, you know, building and all that stuff, and then versus, you know, running around and fighting stuff. So you start to figure that out, because that is not like super obvious the first time that you play. Because if you look at your player board, it's all economic stuff and mechanic driven. And then when you're running around the board, it's all sort of combat and a little bit of like an Ameritrash vibe or a story vibe. So the way that those meld is not super, it's not unintuitive. It's very intuitive in terms of like, what do I do and how do I do it? That's intuitive 100%. But of like, how do I do this in the best and most efficient way? There's some layers there to peel through, but that's actually a good thing in a game. So I think the play time's really going to come down as you start to play through it. But yeah, it was a 3-player game for 4 hours, but again, it was still fun. Now, I'll go to my last pillar, which is sort of like, you know, what is this game like, and then kind of my general thoughts about it. Well, obviously this is kind of like the last or the most current in the trilogy of Above and Below, Near and Far, and Now or Never. This one is my favorite of those, I think by a decent amount. For some reason, I really bounced off of Near and Far, and I really did like Above and Below. And I think this one is more similar to that one, because I feel like the Euro mechanical economics side of this is much stronger than in any of them. And the story elements are done in such a way that it's kind of a light touch, which is really what Above and Below was. Above and Below was like basically a Euro. And then to generate some random resource stuff, you read a little paragraph. And that was it. Didn't really have a very cohesive story, which I liked. I mean, that was kind of actually something that people threw at a knock of the game. But I was like, I'm really having fun with this Euro game. And then you're going to read this little adventure that your guy goes down in a little cave and comes back. I'm like, that's cool. I mean, I get the theme out of the economic side of it. Like, that comes out of it for me in that game. And then this is just that kind of extra color on top of that. And this is very similar in that way. Now, this is a really sort of developed, and I think a lot more advanced of an economic game, because the whole building matrix thing is really neat. And I talked about some of the interaction and stuff. And again, that balance between the venture board and your kind of city building is really neat. And the way that the story, like for me, I would play just with the story in this. Don't even try to play it without the story. There's no reason to really play it in any order. You could just jump around chapters. And one thing I didn't show you was that the adventure board, you can flip it over and it's like an underground version of that board. So you will deal out some different monsters and stuff like that. Some of the locations are a little bit different. So if you want to just do that, that's actually driven by one of the chapters. But the rules tell you can flip it over, swap some monsters out, and you can just play it that way. So there's a little bit of variability there. But the other thing that some of the chapters add is they will put some new encounters in the board, or new like vehicles and stuff like that, or different types of villagers and things like that. I really don't want to spoil any of that, but there'll be a lot more kind of interaction. And again, it's a light touch. It just colors in the world and fills it in. And I really like that. That's just a really kind of neat system. And it kind of reminds me of some of these other games. Alexander Pfister does a lot of that, where you have like a basic sort of Euro that you can play. And then you can work through quote unquote a campaign. And all the campaign really does is sort of like little expansion modules that sort of change up little bitty rules here and there. And that's kind of what this does. And so I really like that. And I will say that some of the story bits in this feel like sort of random throwaway things. But not on the whole. Some of them are very connected, and there will be sort of a thread that goes through some of the chapters and stuff like that. Yeah, it's a little bit more grounded, definitely, than Above and Below. And I think part of the problem with some of these games and some of those Pfister games, and one of the problems I kind of had with like Sleeping Gods and stuff, is like if I run into it enough, or I feel like this is just a random sort of paragraph chunk that was just thrown in there, that kind of starts to irritate me after a while. I will say there's a little bit of that in here, where it's like, what? You ran into this person and they were like gardening in the middle of this desert or something? Like, what? That doesn't make sense. Like, it is a little bit of that. But then there's enough of the other stuff where you start to say, okay, that's fine. Maybe there's some other things that's not very directly connected to that larger narrative. Okay, that's just some outlying stuff. There's enough that is connected to that, and some of the things and encounters that you have that is tied to the specific chapters that keeps it engaging. Yeah. So, and I was going to say I have played with the medium length variant, and that basically is you play only 5 rounds instead of 6. You start off with, I think, an experience point and a villager, some extra money, stuff like that. And then the short one, which I haven't played, you play like 4 rounds and you start with more stuff. I really like the medium one. I would probably suggest that you play the medium one on your first try, maybe the short one. Feels like the short one might be too short to me though. I don't know. But just know going in though, again, maybe not, maybe just play the long one, but just know going in that it's going to be kind of a big experience, especially if you include the story stuff. And I think it's okay. It's just, the game feels very whimsical, so I don't think I was really like expecting a longer, more crunchy, drawn out experience, but I was okay with it, and I was engaged and involved. Like I said, we played 4 hours and we were like, okay, that was a lot longer than we thought, but it was cool and it was worth it. So on the whole, I really recommend this. I think this is probably, a lot of folks like to categorize games by designers. I think this is my favorite Red Raven game ever. Although I'm a little sentimental about 8-Minute Empire. But I really like this one. This one, 8-Minute Empire, and then that space one they did a long time ago that I never played the second edition of. I can't remember what the name of it is. The first edition was really cool. It was like 90% of the way there to being like an amazing game. And I have such a vague memory of it. That one's really good. Empires of the Void, maybe? Anyway, this one's great. This one is really good. I definitely recommend this. If you liked Above and Below, if you liked Near and Far, to me this is really way better than those, and it just knocks it out of the park. All of the mechanical stuff in here is such at the forefront, and that's the stuff that I really like, because I do get a good sense of theme a lot of times out of some of these Euro games, especially if they're done right. They're done in such a way that makes sense to me. Now, because you get a real sense of your city sort of building up, and your collection of villagers, and you're sort of upgrading your avatar with the different weapons and the armor or the different special abilities, and you're going on the quests and all that. But it all just marries together in a really, really solid way. And to me, I think that's one of the most difficult things to do, is keep something kind of engaging kind of both the left and right side of my brain. And I think this one really, really does that, really achieves that. The only thing I wanted to mention other than that is there's an interesting thing, is you can go to a website, there's a flyer in the box, and you can pay, I think it's $15, and you can get the, like an app or something, the Audible reading of all of the different narrative chapter stuff. And I'll be honest with you, the first time when I saw that, I was like, oh, you have to pay for that? I was like, oh, that's kind of chintzy. Because I've been spoiled by Forgotten Waters and Descent Legends of the Dark, who basically they give you the app or whatever for free, right? Now, I did go and listen to some of the samples, and I will say they're excellent. I think they are the best that I've heard, the sound effects and the voice acting, it's right up there with Forgotten Waters and Descent: Legends of the Dark. The voice acting is really good, and the kind of the background ambience and stuff. In some of those other games, the background ambience, like, it gets repetitive. But in this, just a little bit that I heard, maybe it is repetitive, but I thought it was very smart how they kind of splashed some stuff in there. Now, I don't know that you need to do that, because there's not really a ton of reading in the chapters. It's just here and there, quick little paragraph, boom, 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 little paragraph of results. Not a ton of reading. So the reading shouldn't really, I think, dissuade you. But I do think it would be interesting if they, and which I might actually pay for the app if they did this, where they would add in more chapters or something. Just more little variants and stuff, because I think this is something that I think I'll get a good number of plays through it. I could probably see myself playing through each chapter. Well, I played through chapter 1 a few times now, but playing through some of the other chapters a couple of times each. And even if I played through each chapter 3 times, that's 18 plays. I mean, you got your money's worth right there. But, down the road, I could see some interesting things where they had like a chapter 7. And you could take some of the special chapter components and do something with that and rules, or just at least like mix up, like do alternate versions of the chapters. Because I think if you revisited some of the same like quest encounters, search encounters again and again, that could kind of wear on you a little bit. Just because you have to read through it. Whereas if you fight the same monster again, it's a mechanical engagement, whereas a story engagement, it works a little bit differently. So if you kind of randomized just the encounters parts of it with the app, I think that would be kind of a cool kind of DLC or something, just little alternative stories or something. Anyway, but yeah, definitely recommend the game. Give it a try. A little bit of a warning on the playtime, but again, there's variants. Recommend the medium variant, but even the long variant. It's long, but I think it's worth it. So that's now or never. Thanks.